A WTOL 11 investigation into whether one of our area's most heinous killers had more victims. Sierah Jourgin wasn't James Worley's only victim when he plucked her off her bike and killed her in 2016. He also kidnapped a woman in White House back in 1990 and served just 3 years in prison for that. But was he dormant before Sierra's killing, or did he kidnap and murder anyone else from 1990 to 2016?
It is highly unusual that someone that would have offended in a similar manner 20-some years before, has now done this and hasn't done anything in between.
I am sure that he's offended other women. Now, whether they're still alive and they just have not come forward, or whether they're cold cases and he's just not been tied to them yet, but he just has that personality and narcissistic behavior that.
On a warm July evening in 2016, Sierah Jourgin set out for a bike ride but never returned home. Hours later, a frantic search led to a chilling discovery: a discarded bike, signs of a struggle, and a trail that hinted at something far worse. As investigators followed the evidence, they uncovered a dark secret hidden on a remote property. Inside a secluded barn, they found proof of a twisted predator who had been lurking in plain sight. But who was he? And what really happened to Sierah Jourgin? Welcome to the crime series. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you're watching from. Sierah Catherine Jourgin was born on February 11, 1996 in Sylvania, Ohio. From the very beginning, she was the kind of person who left an impression on everyone she met. With a bright smile, an infectious laugh, and an undeniable warmth, she was the kind of girl who made people feel at ease just by being around her. She was known for her kindness, her ambition, and the way she always seemed to be moving towards something greater. Those who loved her affectionately called her Say, a nickname that suited her perfectly. Sierah grew up surrounded by family, a tight-knit support system that shaped her into the person she was. She had 4 siblings and was especially close to her mother, Sheila, who she talked to every day. Family meant everything to her, and no matter how busy she got, she always made time for them. She graduated from Evergreen High School in 2014, where she was known for her hard work and determination. She had big dreams and was determined to make them a reality. Before her demise, she was a student at the University of Toledo, studying human resource management. She was ambitious and focused, already interning at her uncle's metal stamping business, gaining real-world experience that would set her up for the future she had envisioned. But Sierah wasn't just about work and school. She had a passion for life, for adventure, for the little things that made life special. She had been in a loving relationship with her high school sweetheart, Josh Kolasinski, for 7 years. They had grown up together, navigating the ups and downs of adolescence, building a connection that felt unbreakable. They dreamed about the future, about careers, about travel, about one day starting a life together. It was the kind of love that felt solid, the kind that had been built over years of shared memories and deep understanding. On the evening of July 19, 2016, Sierah and Josh set out for what should have been an ordinary bike ride. It was a warm summer evening in Fulton County, Ohio, the kind of night that made everything feel peaceful and safe. Sierah pedaled along on her bright purple bicycle, her dark hair flowing behind her, while Josh rode alongside her on his motorcycle. They laughed, they talked, they enjoyed the easy rhythm of being together. It was one of those simple, perfect moments. A warm evening, a familiar road, and the company of someone she loved. As they reached a crossroads, it was time for them to part ways. Josh was headed in one direction, and Sierra's home was just a short ride away in the other. He pulled his motorcycle to a stop, leaned in, and gave her a quick kiss before watching her pedal off. It was 6:45 p.m., everything seemed perfectly fine. But as the hours passed, uneasiness began to settle in. Sierra's mother, Sheila Vaclav, arrived at their home expecting to see her daughter safely inside. But the house was quiet. Her bedroom light was off. At first, Sheila brushed it off. Maybe Sierra had stopped somewhere or lost track of time. After all, she had been with her boyfriend, Josh Kolasinski, earlier in the evening. But then, at 10:30 p.m., Sheila's phone rang. It was Josh, and his voice was tight with worry. Is Sierra home? That single question sent a chill through Sheila. Sierra should have been home hours ago. If she had planned to stay out late, she would have called, sent a text, something. But there had been nothing. Sheila called Sierra's friends, hoping someone had seen her or heard from her, but one by one, they all said the same thing. No one had heard from Sierra since earlier that evening. Panic took hold. Without wasting another moment, Sheila called the police to report her daughter missing. Then, she and Josh, along with family members and friends, got into their cars and began searching. They retraced the route Sierra would have taken home, their headlights cutting through the darkness, calling out her name into the still night. The roads were empty, the cornfields towering on either side, their thick, impenetrable stalks making the search even more terrifying. When the police arrived, they took the case seriously. A young woman disappearing without a trace was never something to ignore, especially in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew themselves. They asked Josh to go over every detail, every moment of the last time he saw her. He showed them a Snapchat video he had taken of her earlier that day, Sierra riding her bike, her face lit up with a carefree smile. The officers immediately began searching the area where she had last been seen. It wasn't long before they found something. Near the edge of a cornfield, several stalks were bent and broken, as if something or someone had been dragged inside. A few rows in, they found her bike. The handlebars were smeared with blood. Nearby lay her sunglasses, but even more chilling, there was a second pair of sunglasses that didn't belong to her. The officer's eyes moved to the other items scattered nearby: a screwdriver, a motorcycle helmet, and a sense of something much darker lingering in the air. The helmet appeared to have blood on it, a chilling detail that turned the search into something more than just a missing persons case. This was no accident. Something violent had happened here. Immediately, the search efforts intensified. Officers widened their perimeter, combing through the surrounding fields, calling out Sierra's name into the night. Volunteers worked tirelessly alongside them, their voices breaking the night silence, but there was no response, no sign of Sierra. The realization was sinking in fast. Something bad had happened. As investigators documented the evidence at the scene, another team began looking for digital clues that might lead them to her. They rechecked the video Josh had taken of Sierra earlier that day, a short Snapchat video. In the footage, she was wearing her Fitbit watch. Fitbit's watches weren't just fitness accessories. They tracked movement, recorded heart rates, and stored location data. If her watch was still active, it could provide a timeline of where she had gone or where she had been taken. Investigators immediately began working to access the device's information, hoping it could give them a lead in a case where time was slipping away far too quickly. Meanwhile, Sierra's phone remained unreachable. Every call went straight to voicemail, and every unanswered message deepened the fear that was already gripping her family. Investigators reached out to her cell phone provider, requesting the last known location before the device had gone silent. If they could pinpoint where her phone had last been active, it might give them a clue about where to focus their search. As the night wore on, exhaustion set in, but no one was willing to give up. Sheila, Sierra's mother, refused to go home. She stood with officers, watching, waiting, clinging to hope that her daughter would be found alive. Josh was the same, his face tense, his hands clenched as he retraced his steps again and again in his mind, trying to think of anything that might help the investigators. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the fields, the search expanded. More officers arrived, along with trained search teams and K-9 units. The entire community rallied together, desperate to find Sierra. But as officers knocked on doors, speaking with neighbors, they found that no one had seen anything unusual. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, nothing that suggested someone had been lurking in the area. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Then, investigators came across a man who lived nearby, James Worley. He was a small engine mechanic who ran a repair shop from his home, just a few miles from where Sierra had vanished. When officers approached his house, something about his demeanor felt off. He seemed too prepared for their questions, as if he had already been expecting them. Before they could even explain why they were there, he spoke. His voice was calm, but strangely defensive. He told them he knew about the search and that his motorcycle had broken down near the area they were investigating. He claimed he had been forced to leave behind some of his belongings, a helmet, a screwdriver, and a pair of sunglasses. The officers tensed. They hadn't told him what they had found yet. His words matched exactly with the items discovered in the cornfield. And then, without being asked, he blurted out something that made every officer's instincts go on high alert. "I didn't steal anything or kill anyone." It was an odd thing to say, especially since no one had accused him of anything. His sudden need to deny involvement without being prompted made him an immediate person of interest. Then they noticed something else. His arms were scratched, as if he had been through a struggle. His legs, visible beneath his shorts, were covered in bruises. It was impossible to ignore, but there was still one haunting question left unanswered. Where was Sierah?
As we go into the most intense part of this video, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me motivation to create more videos. If you love this video and wish to see more, kindly subscribe.
The officers didn't wait. They secured a search warrant for Worley's property quarry. With a search warrant in place, officers began combing through his property, and it didn't take long before they found things that sent shivers down their spines. Inside one of his barns, hidden behind a wall of hay bales, they discovered what could only be described as a makeshift dungeon. The space was cold and its purpose horrifyingly clear. Restraints were fastened to the walls. Zip ties, tape, handcuffs, everything needed to hold someone against their will. A freezer sat in the corner, its interior wiped down with bleach, but still carrying traces of what looked like blood. The air inside was thick with the sharp chemical scent of cleaning agents, as if someone had tried to erase the horrors that had taken place there. Beyond the barn, more disturbing discoveries emerged. In his truck, officers found additional zip ties, rope, and a ski mask. There were 2 sets of handcuffs tucked away, alongside a can of mace. It wasn't just the kind of equipment someone happened to own, it was a collection designed for one thing: control. Then, there were the journals. Among Worley's possessions, investigators found handwritten notes that painted a chilling picture of his mind. He had detailed his thoughts, his fantasies, his obsession with abducting women. The words were dark, revealing a man who had spent years envisioning the exact kind of crime that had just occurred. One entry stood out among the rest, scrawled in his own messy handwriting. "If I ever get caught, I'll go out shooting. No way I can let them put me away." But he hadn't gone out shooting. Instead, he stood on his porch, watching as officers dismantled his world piece by piece. There was no running now. The evidence was piling up too fast, the walls closing in too tightly. As officers searched deeper, his digital footprint began to unravel. Detectives accessed his computer, uncovering a disturbing trail of internet searches. His history was littered with terms like hogtied, teen, rape, helpless, and stranded hitchhiker. It wasn't just casual curiosity, it was a roadmap of his darkest intentions. Then, there was the past. Worley wasn't new to this kind of crime. 26 years earlier, in 1990, he had attacked another young woman, Robin Gardner, in a horrifyingly similar way. She had been cycling down a quiet road when Worley had run her off the road with his truck. He had pretended to help, only to knock her unconscious and drag her into his vehicle. He had handcuffed her, held a screwdriver to her throat, and threatened to kill her. But Robin had managed to escape, fleeing to a passing motorcyclist who saved her life. At the time, Worley had been arrested and convicted of abduction, but the justice system had failed. He had only served 3 years in prison before being released, free to blend back into society, free to plan, free to wait for his next victim. Standing there now, as officers uncovered the grim details of his hidden world, it was clear that he had never changed. The crime he had committed in 1990 had not been a one-time act of violence, it had been a preview of what was to come. But there was still one thing missing: Sierah. James Worley was brought in for questioning, but he refused to cooperate. His face remained eerily calm, his tone never rising in panic or frustration. When confronted with the dungeon hidden in his barn, he brushed it off, claiming it was meant for a pornography studio he had been planning. When asked about the blood found on his helmet, he had no explanation. Every answer he gave was another lie, another evasion. The officers pushed harder. They knew the truth was right in front of them, but Worley refused to break. He had spent decades perfecting the ability to hide his darkness from the world, and now, even as the evidence piled up against him, he wouldn't admit to what he had done. Meanwhile, Sierra's family was running out of hope. Every moment that passed without finding her alive chipped away at the belief that she might still come home. They had gone from searching for a missing girl to fearing they were looking for a body. The search for Sierra wasn't just about finding justice. It was a race against time, and the officers knew that somewhere, buried beneath all of Worley's lies, was the one thing they needed most: the truth. The search for Sierra Jourgin had become a desperate, relentless effort, with investigators, volunteers, and loved ones refusing to give up hope. The evidence found at James Worley's property had painted a horrifying picture of what had likely happened to her: the restraints, the hidden barn, the ski mask, the blood inside the freezer. But still, the most crucial piece was missing: Sierra herself. Police expanded their search, combing through fields, ditches, wooded areas, anywhere Worley might have taken her. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the vast landscape for any unusual signs. Search dogs worked tirelessly, trying to pick up her scent. Volunteers walked miles of open land, their eyes scanning every inch of ground, hoping to see something that would lead them to her. Then, on the third day after her disappearance, the heartbreaking discovery was made. 12 miles from Worley's home, deep in another isolated cornfield, officers found a patch of disturbed earth. The dirt had been roughly moved, uneven, and hastily covered. As they stepped closer, the sinking feeling in their stomachs grew stronger. They knew what they were about to find. With careful hands, they began digging. And then, buried in the shallow grave, they saw her. Sierra's body had been bound, gagged, and hogtied. Her wrists were handcuffed, her ankles bound with rope, the restraints tying her in a position meant to restrict movement completely. Her mouth had been stuffed with a large yellow plastic object, later identified as what appeared to be a dog toy. It had been forced into her mouth, preventing her from breathing. The positioning of her body, the way she had been restrained, it was clear she had suffered in her final moments. There were no signs of sexual assault, but that did not make the crime any less cruel. She had been taken, brutalized, and left to die. The officers who stood over the grave felt the weight of the moment. Even though they had feared this would be the outcome, even though they had prepared themselves, seeing her there, lifeless and abandoned, was devastating. News of the discovery spread quickly. Sierra's family, who had spent every waking moment praying for a miracle, now faced the cruel reality they had been dreading. Their daughter, their sister, their friend, and a lover was gone. The grief that followed was immeasurable. She had been full of life, with so much ahead of her, only to have it stolen in the worst possible way. The autopsy confirmed the nightmare. Sierra had died from asphyxiation. The object forced into her mouth had blocked her airways, depriving her brain of oxygen. The medical examiner estimated that it had taken several agonizing minutes for her to die. She had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head, including a skull fracture, likely caused by being struck with Worley's motorcycle helmet. The evidence was overwhelming. This was no accident. This was a calculated, brutal murder. Despite the undeniable proof, James Worley still refused to talk. He never admitted to anything, never showed remorse. But the evidence told the story for him. Sierra's blood had been found on his helmet. The zip ties that had restrained her contained traces of her DNA. His barn had been set up as a prison, a place built for captivity. Every detail pointed to him, leaving no doubt that he was responsible. The community was outraged. The heartbreak quickly turned into anger. People demanded justice. They wanted to make sure that James Worley would never have the chance to do something like this again. With the discovery of Sierra's body, the case against Worley was stronger than ever. Prosecutors knew they had everything they needed to convict him. Sierra's family, though shattered by loss, was determined to see him held accountable. The trial was approaching, and when it did, the world would finally hear the full truth of what had happened to Sierra Jourgin. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case. They carefully pieced together a timeline of events using forensic evidence, digital data, and expert analysis to reconstruct what had happened on the night Sierah was taken. The picture that emerged was chilling. Investigators believed that Worley had been lurking on that quiet rural road when he spotted Sierah riding her bike alone. It was a chance encounter, but it was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for. He followed her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When they reached a secluded stretch of road surrounded by towering cornfields, he made his move. They believed that Worley used his motorcycle to force her off the road, sending her bicycle crashing into the field. Then, as she struggled to make sense of what had happened, he struck her over the head with his helmet, dazing or knocking her unconscious. That was when he dragged her deeper into the cornfield, away from the road, where no one could see or hear what was happening. Struggling to free herself? Was she calling out for help, hoping someone would hear her? Or was she unconscious, unable to fight back? These were questions only Worley could answer, but he remained silent. After 2 hours, he left. Investigators believed that he returned home to get his van, then drove back to the cornfield under the cover of darkness to retrieve Sierah. By then, she was completely restrained, her wrists handcuffed, her ankles bound, her mouth stuffed with an object that would later be identified as a large yellow plastic device. She was completely helpless. Worley then took her to the hidden room in his barn, a space investigators now knew had been designed for one purpose: captivity. The walls were lined with restraints. There was a mattress on the floor, stained and worn. A freezer sat in the corner, with traces of blood inside. The smell of bleach hung in the air, evidence that someone had tried to clean up after something terrible had happened. At some point during the night, something went wrong. The prosecution believed that while Sierah was tied up in that barn, the object that had been forced into her mouth blocked her airway completely. She suffocated, dying slowly over the course of several minutes. By the time Worley returned to check on her, she was gone. Faced with a dead body, Worley did what he had likely planned to do all along. He loaded her into his van, drove 12 miles away to another remote cornfield, and hastily dug a shallow grave. He covered her body with dirt, hoping that no one would ever find her. Then he went home, cleaned up the evidence, and carried on with his life as if nothing had happened. In all this, Worley has refused to speak. The case against him was solid. The physical evidence, digital evidence, and his history of violence all pointed to the same undeniable conclusion: James Worley was guilty. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Worley's defense team tried to create doubt. They argued that while the prosecution had provided strong circumstantial evidence, they could not prove beyond all doubt that Worley was the one who had caused Sierah's death. They claimed that while his items were found near the scene and his DNA was present, there was no direct proof that he had been the one to end her life. In an effort to shift suspicion, they even suggested that another unknown person could have been involved, though they had no actual evidence to support this claim. Throughout the trial, Worley himself remained silent. He never took the stand, never spoke in his own defense. He sat motionless, showing no emotion. He never apologized, never showed remorse. The jury listened intently, absorbing the testimonies, the forensic findings, the disturbing digital evidence. After days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Sierah's family, the prosecution, and even the spectators waited anxiously. Hours passed, the weight of the decision pressing on everyone in the room. After 6 hours, the jury returned. As they filed into the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge turned to the jury foreman and asked for the verdict. Guilty, on all counts. A quiet sob escaped from Sierah's mother. Josh, her boyfriend, closed his eyes, his hands clenched into fists. It was the verdict they had been praying for, but there was no relief, only a sense of finality. Justice had been served, but it would never bring Sierah back. With the guilty verdict delivered, the focus of the trial shifted to the sentencing phase, a decision that would determine James Worley's fate. He had been convicted on multiple charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and assault. Now, the jury had to decide whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole or be sentenced to death. The weight of this decision hung heavily over the courtroom, especially for Sierah Jugin's family, who had already endured so much pain. They had fought for justice, and now they had to watch as the man who had stolen Sierah's future faced the ultimate punishment. The prosecution was unrelenting in their argument for the death penalty. They painted Worley as a remorseless predator, a man who had spent years fantasizing about abducting and harming women. They reminded the jury of the brutality of Sierah's final moments, how she had been bound, gagged, and left to suffocate in a slow, agonizing death. They showed photographs from the crime scene, the restraints found in Worley's barn, and the shallow grave where Sierah had been buried like discarded trash. Every piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's claim. This was a calculated, deliberate act of evil, and Worley deserved the harshest punishment available under the law. The prosecution also reminded the jury that this was not Worley's first offense. This pattern of violence, they argued, proved that Sierah's murder had not been a moment of impulse or desperation. It had been years in the making. Worley's defense team, however, was desperate to spare him from execution. They pleaded with the jury to consider his mental state, arguing that he was a deeply disturbed individual who suffered from significant psychological disorders. They called a criminal psychologist, Dr. John Fabian, to testify. Dr. Fabian explained that Worley suffered from sexual paraphilia disorder, a condition that caused him to experience abnormal, violent sexual urges, often involving control and restraint. The defense argued that this mental illness did not excuse his actions, but should be considered a mitigating factor when determining his punishment. Then came a bizarre and unsettling moment. Worley himself chose to speak. His 45-minute statement was a rambling, disconnected monologue in which he insisted that he had been framed. He claimed that someone else had kidnapped and murdered Sierah, leaving evidence behind to make him look guilty. At one point, he even addressed Sierah's family, calling her a beautiful girl and saying that her loss was a substantial blow to everyone. His words were hollow, lacking any real emotion or remorse.
Are wounded, and they always will be. But if you believe like I believe that Sierah goes on. She may have been murdered and victimized, but she goes on.
If anything, his statement only reinforced what the prosecution had been saying all along, that Worley was manipulative, self-serving, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. With both sides having made their final arguments, the jury was set to deliberate once again. This time, they were not deciding whether Worley was guilty. That had already been determined. Now, they had to decide whether he deserved to live or die. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The judge asked if they had reached a decision. The jury foreman stood and spoke the words that would seal James Worley's fate. They had sentenced him to death. A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sierah's mother let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Josh, Sierah's longtime boyfriend, lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. It was the outcome they had hoped for, but it didn't bring relief, only a sense of finality. No sentence could ever bring back Sierah, but at least now, the man who had taken her life would never harm another person again. After being sentenced to death for the 2016 murder of Sierah Jugin, James Worley has remained on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio. His execution is scheduled for May 20th, 2025. Since his sentencing, Worley has pursued multiple legal avenues to overturn his conviction and delay his execution. In July 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld his death sentence, affirming the original decision. Following this, Worley filed motions seeking a stay of execution, arguing for additional time to explore further appeals. In September 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court temporarily suspended his execution to allow for these legal processes to continue. As of now, Worley's execution remains scheduled for May 20th, 2025, pending the outcome of any further appeals or legal interventions.